large-scale dismantling of the integrity of our democratic system. And this comes at a time when states have consistently and systematically worked to pass restrictive voting laws. Since 2020 alone, 21 states have passed laws making it more difficult to participate. These laws make it harder to register, harder to vote by mail, harder to stay on the voter rolls. All in all, they make it harder for Americans to exercise this fundamental right. We must respond. Vitally, we must do everything that we can to combat intimidation, to combat electoral subversion, and the interference which I've described. The next few days are critical. We need to ensure every eligible voter has the ability to carry out their right. And in the long term, we need to continue to fight against these dangerous and regressive efforts. It means that we must agree on the basic norms of democracy, the sanctity of free and fair elections, the peaceful transfer of power, and a complete condemnation of any and all political violence. Today, we're honored to be joined by two leaders representing both political parties who have been at the forefront of these efforts to protect and safeguard our democracy and our right to vote. Lee Chapman, the acting Secretary of the Commonwealth for Pennsylvania, and Trey Grayson, the former Secretary of State for Kentucky. I'm going to hand things over to Will Roberts, CAP's Managing Director of Democracy Policy, to offer further introductions. But I just want to take a moment to thank both of our panelists for their efforts and for their leadership. They've been and continue to be among the leading guard in the fight to protect our democracy. Will, over to you.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and welcome to our guests and our audience in attendance for this virtual conversation today. I want to remind folks joining us that you can input questions for our guests using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we're going to get to some audience questions later on in our conversation. As Patrick mentioned, a week out from Election Day, we're excited to have this really important conversation with two bipartisan leaders who have themselves been and are currently responsible for administering statewide elections, but also who have been really important voices on the things that we have to do to address the threats to our democracy and on trying to forge a way forward together to strengthen it. And so I want to welcome Secretary of the Commonwealth, Pennsylvania, Lee Chapman, and former Secretary of State, Trey Grayson from Kentucky. Thank you both for joining us this morning. And let's dive right in. So as you both know, election officials at the state and local levels are under tremendous pressure, a week out from Election Day, and have been for several years now, both because there are elements in our country spreading mis and disinformation that is confusing voters. There's a voter suppression activity going on, and a real assault that people feel on our democracy. And, some of that is borne out, we know, from the last election cycle, where we saw even the former president, right, famously or infamously try to pressure one of your colleagues, Secretary Brad Raffensperger, to shift and change election results in Georgia. So I wondered if we could start this conversation having you all describe both your personal experiences in administering elections and in talking to colleagues who are doing so, under these conditions. And let's start with Secretary Chapman, if we could.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much, William and Cap, for having me here today to talk about elections. We are a week out, and election officials in Pennsylvania are really dedicated to ensuring that we have a safe and secure election here in just a few days. And in Pennsylvania, we have 67 counties. So election directors in those counties actually execute and administer the election. But, as one thing you mentioned is, unfortunately, since the 2020 election, we have seen a slew of mis and disinformation around our elections here in Pennsylvania. And a lot of it has really centered around mail-in voting, because the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania did not get universal mail-in voting until 2019. So a lot later than many other states that have been used to that culture of mail-in voting. And we've also seen a slew of litigation. There were over 24 lawsuits in 2020, We're dealing with over a dozen lawsuits just now in 2022. And since 2020, counties have really been inundated with a lot of right to know requests as well, which are our public records requests. So counties are dealing with that at the same time as executing an election. And because of that strain and stress on many counties, we've seen over 50 county election directors in Pennsylvania leave their jobs since 2020. So we've had a significant number of turnover. I mean, some of it has been because of planned retirements or, changes in jobs. But unfortunately, some people have left their roles because of the threats, threats to themselves, threats to, their employees, threats to their family, which really has no place in democracy. There should not be threats against frontline election workers that are just doing their jobs to make sure that every eligible voter can cast a ballot. These are your friends and your neighbors just trying to do their job. So we are doing everything we can to support counties, to support those election directors that are somewhat new to the role. And this might be the first election that they are actually administering and executing. So at the Department of State, I've been here since January. My role is really to oversee the voting process for those 67 counties, to make sure that they are following the law, to issue guidance, to clarify any questions they might have about the electoral process. And we actually meet with them. Well, it was on a biweekly basis, but right now it's almost a daily basis to make sure that they have the tools and resources they need to execute a safe and secure election. And I'll just close by saying that, one thing that we've been doing since 2020 is really partnering with our federal agencies, also our state law enforcement agencies. We've had extensive tabletop exercises with the counties, with the Department of State, to ensure that counties have the tools to protect themselves against threats, and also to identify if there are any insider threats as well, and to have training on de-escalation and also cybersecurity. So it's something that we are continually to provide to counties to make sure that they have those resources.
So I want to ditto +1 everything that Secretary Chapman said. I've been around election administration for almost 20 years now. I was just thinking that it was about 20 years ago, around this time of year, when I started to think about my campaign for Secretary of State in Kentucky. I was elected in 2003 and still am very involved both in Kentucky and nationally. While Kentucky and Pennsylvania are both commonwealths, we're a different state in the sense of we have not been in the nation's eye as a battleground state in the presidential race. We don't have a big governor's race or a big U.S. Senate race, although we have a U.S. Senate race, but most analysts deem it not to be very competitive. Our big stress this year are local elections, where we're electing all of our county officials, which are really big elections here. One of the things that's been striking to me over those 20 years is the amount of stress, and Secretary Chapman mentioned the retirements of election administrators. We're seeing that in our state as well. We're seeing it across the country. Again, some of it is planned retirement, but many of these election administrators will tell you it's just not worth it. It's tiring. It's just a lot of extra effort. Kentucky, Pennsylvania, every other state in the country were bombarded with open records requests a few weeks ago. From folks who still believe that the 2020 election was stolen falsely, to be clear. And the reason for that was the timing, that we have to keep election records for about 22 months, and those records are about ready to be destroyed, or at least the protections were being removed. And so there was this last minute push to gather this data, and people all across the country didn't know what they were doing necessarily, but they cut and paste and did open record requests or FOIA or whatever the process is in a particular state. Some of these folks were probably well-intentioned, just misguided. Others were bad actors, but it interfered with planning. And, things like that, we just never had to worry about before. We always had open records opportunities and FOIA requests, but never in such large amounts at such a critical time for elections. I will say one piece of good news, and I always like to try to add a little bit of good news to this conversation, is 2 years ago, we were trying to figure out how to administer an election in the midst of a pandemic. We didn't have vaccines. We had election administrators. We had offices being closed because somebody got COVID. Everybody was working in close quarters, close contact. And then there was a fear among election administrators, oh gosh, what if this would have happened right before election day, or right before early voting started, or when we're trying to process absentee ballots? while COVID is obviously still around and still an issue, that is at least one positive thing that we've been able to, we're not facing right now. But the rise of mis and disinformation over the last couple of years, sparked mostly by President Trump and folks who follow him. We're still battling the cybersecurity issues that really came to the forefront in 2016 when there was Russian interference in our election. And fortunately, there's some good news there. As Secretary mentioned, there's a lot more cooperation with federal agencies who are really in the lead in helping state and locals with their cybersecurity and our defenses. I would also add one thing that I think is helpful is our programs like this. Most news outlets, all the national news outlets have reporters who focus on election administration issues and can help tell the story, help set expectations for voters and policymakers, and local radio, local television, local newspapers and websites. They're also covering election administration more. And I think that'll help voters figure out what they can believe, what are the actual rules, where they can go for trusted information. And that's been a nice improvement. So I appreciate the partnership that we've been able to develop in the elections world with the media and with other stakeholder groups that didn't necessarily step in. If you watch, I was watching my Bengals lose to the Browns last night on Monday Night Football, and there was an ad from the NFL talking about the fact that many NFL teams are opening up their stadiums for polling places. They were reminding people to vote, and they've been doing that all season long. So there are a lot of new stakeholders that are stepping up to the plate, which these are all some good things that shine a little bit of positive light in some of the darkness.
Well, that's really good to hear. I'll add as a good Philadelphian, I'm happy about seeing my Eagles take a different trajectory. But I'm going to pick up, where you all took us both on a little bit to dig a little bit more on disinformation and violence, right? Like it's really good to hear this coordination that's happening and going on, because especially on the disinformation front, it feels often like it's such a huge problem to wrap our arms around, because it is, right? And we know that secretaries of state play a critical role, and as you said, a role that hadn't been necessarily imagined as it is today years ago in pushing back on pushing back and combating that mis and disinformation. Can you talk, both of you, a little bit more, I guess, for folks who are really interested in what that coordination looks like? You talked, Secretary Grayson, about some of the information sharing that's being pushed out. I'm wondering, particularly as you all both focused on elections administration at the local level, what kind of two-way information sharing do you all have with colleagues on the ground, and what role is the federal government playing? And as an addendum to that, what more can the federal government be doing? We know, certainly, I think just this morning, the National Association of State Election Directors put out a statement about, what efforts are being taken to combat what they expect to be an uptick of mis and disinformation between now and Election Day. So talk a little bit more, I guess, about what that coordination looks like, and also what are some additional things perhaps that the federal government could step in and do that. And then I'll come back and ask you a question about another topic related to sort of election related violence.
So I think you wanted me to go first in this one.
Sure.
Let me I think one of the things, and there needs to be a nice division of labor, in election administration. In most states, the locals are the ones that are really administering elections, and at the state level, we're making policy, we're providing guidance and training and setting standards and overseeing and implementing the law. We're also interacting with the federal government. So I think that the state level, the Secretary of State or State Elections Director, depending on how it's done in a state, can play a really big role in helping locals. So let me brag about our current Secretary of State in Kentucky, Mike Adams. Mike put together on his website kind of an FAQ of things that people have heard on myths and then truths, going through different claims about Kentucky elections or national elections, and then putting the truth right below it. What was great about that was, if you're a county clerk in Kentucky and you have a constituent who starts asking a series of questions, you might be able to answer some of those, but maybe you can't. And you can say, hey, go check out that website. Go look there, and then come back if you have any more questions, and I can talk about how it's done locally. So that's been a good resource for locals to use, and it's efficient. And so things like that, federal national groups can do the same things from the state level. But I thought that was a great idea to kind of explain. Another thing that I think has happened more is many of our legislators are actually asking, they're bringing the county clerks to testify during informational hearings. We have a part-time legislature. So in the rest of the year, what we call the interim, they hear topics and can do deeper dives and do things that maybe you can't do at the heat of the session. And so our clerks have come in and talked about our risk limiting audit pilot program, talked about the security measures that are in place, gave candid feedback about how the primary went and what they hope for the general. It also served as an opportunity for legislators to ask questions. I heard this. Can you tell me is this true or false? That extra kind of engagement was pretty helpful, and it happened earlier in the election. And I think that the cybersecurity that before the 2016 election, we had such silos that election administrators often didn't have appropriate security clearances to even find out what was going on in their own states. So the state, like the feds, could tell maybe the state's chief information or chief security officer, but that person couldn't share with a state election director or secretary of state, let alone a local official, hey, we've heard about this threat in your state, because they didn't have the property security clearances. So we solved that problem, and the secretary mentioned tabletop exercises, which are a great training tool where you simulate threats. That coordination didn't exist 8 years ago. And it is really important because it's a team effort, and what happens in one county or one state impacts everybody else because the perception of a problem with an election, impacts the trust that folks have in all kinds of other jurisdictions.
Secretary Chapman, thanks for that. Secretary.
Yes, I agree. And, the biggest challenge that we are facing right now, a week to the election, is mis and disinformation in Pennsylvania. And we've really seen an uptick of it recently. A lot of it is related to mail-in voting and the fact that we do not have pre-election day pre-canvassing in Pennsylvania. So in the Commonwealth, election officials are only able to start opening mail-in or absentee ballots at 7 a.m. on election day. And this is the same time they're running a 13-hour election at the polls from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. So that's why it takes us some time to make sure that all ballots are counted, because during those 13 hours, counties can start taking them out of the outer envelope, the inner envelope, checking the outside to make sure that, everything is complete. They can scan them, but they can't release results until 8 p.m. on election night. So going through all those ballots right now, we have 1.4 million ballot requests. Today is the deadline for voters to request a mail-in ballot. It takes time to count all those 1.4 million ballots and, manage an election where you have even more millions of voters voting in person. So every opportunity I get, I'm telling the media, the public, the legislature, anyone who would listen. That's why people are always saying, what's going on with Pennsylvania? Why is it taking so long for Pennsylvania to have results? It's because we don't have that pre-election day pre-canvassing. So it's going to take a few days. But one thing that we support at the department, the governor supports, many members of the legislature support, but it just has not been passed, is at least 2 weeks of pre-canvassing. There are states that have over 20 days to start processing those mail-in and absentee votes. That's why states like Florida can have those results right on election night. So it's something that we're continuing to advocate for. But as that count is going, I think that's an opportunity for people to spread mis and disinformation about the voting process. And we're seeing that already. As I'm trying to manage expectations about the count, people are saying, oh, that means something nefarious is happening. And it's not. It's just the limitations that we are dealing with in the Commonwealth as far as how votes are counted. And it's really important that we're not rushing that. It's important that counties are doing their job to make sure every vote is counted, every eligible vote is counted. So that's one thing that we're seeing as a trend as far as misinformation. There was also some misinformation about ballots going out without, verified ID. And under the Help America Vote Act and in Pennsylvania, if a voter doesn't provide ID or their last 4 digits of a social security number when they apply for a mail-in ballot, that county sends it out. But the voter has 6 days after the election to provide that identification. So there's been a lot of misinformation about that. But one thing we're doing as we see these trends, we are having media education briefings with local and national media to help dispel some of this misinformation and to make sure that they have truthful information from the department, from the source. We are working with fact checkers like Reuters and AP. We are referring all these trends. We also have a good feedback loop with our federal partners as well. We report mis and disinformation to the social media companies, and we've had conversations with all of the major companies pre-election day. We've also had trainings with Department of Homeland Security, CISA, with the 67 counties on mis, dis, and malinformation, what it looks like, also how counties can have tools to report it. But the main thing is, we are really utilizing our social media platform, our platform as far as media education, just so the 8.8 million registered voters in Pennsylvania actually have the accurate information, and that they can go to us at the Department of State for the trusted source of info.
Thank you both for sharing there. It's good to hear that deep coordination. The other thing that you both raised sort of in your introductions is what sadly is on a lot of Americans' minds, a lot of voters' minds, the rise of political threats and violence, both associated with elections, but also really just associated with our civic lives. We saw certainly that attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband recently, and we know of, you both spoke of the threats that have been made to elected officials, elections officials, poll workers. Can you talk about sort of what secretaries of state are doing to make sure that folks can vote safely, right? And the coordination that you're doing, the state level and the federal level with law enforcement partners, to make sure that the voting process is safe, that the counting and canvassing process is secure, but also, I guess, address, if you would, what this threat of violence means for, our elections going forward, and how y'all are going to have to deal with it. And sorry, can you start with Secretary Chapman?
Yes, I think this is a perfect segue from what we were just talking about, because the mis and disinformation really fuels the threats to election workers at the state level, at the local level. And it's something that's very concerning, but we see a direct connection between the trends of the misinformation and when threats pick up. So we coordinate with our state and federal partners. As I mentioned before, when we get any incoming into our office, we forward it to state and federal partners. They investigate that, we refer it, and we encourage our counties to do the same thing. We are definitely monitoring situations as voting is happening right now, especially at drop boxes, for instance. We actually updated our voter intimidation guidance in Pennsylvania just a few months ago to include that voter intimidation is not only illegal under state and federal law at the polling place, but that also extends to drop boxes. And that's a new trend that we've seen. Everybody has seen an uptick in Arizona. Luckily, we have not seen any Arizona style intimidation in Pennsylvania, but it's something that we are monitoring, and we did add that to our voter intimidation guidance. And we are pushing out our hotline. So we are encouraging voters, of course, if you're in imminent threat or danger, you call 911, but we are really pushing out our voter hotline to ensure that people can call us and report those instances of the Department of State, because it's important that we are keeping a log, seeing if there's any trends. But we aren't wasting any time. As soon as something does come in, we are reporting it directly to state and federal as soon as we can, to make sure that people are protected. But those tabletop exercises that we've had, that we mentioned before, have been really critical to ensure that counties have the protection that they need. One great thing that Department of Homeland Security, CISA, does is they actually go out to the counties at their request, and they do physical security assessments. So quite a few counties in Pennsylvania have taken them up on that offer. They've had assessments to their physical security. They give recommendations. CISA gives recommendations as far as what they can do to shore up their security, where their machines are stored or what have you. And counties have made adjustments to shore up that security based on what DHS is recommending.
That's great. Secretary Chris.
Yeah, well, we are in a just uncharted waters with this, just in the last couple of years alone. You mentioned the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband. We had somebody show up in the neighborhood for Justice Kavanaugh looking for him. Fortunately, he and his family weren't home. A couple of years ago, we had the shooting at the Republicans practicing for the congressional baseball game, and then going back to Congresswoman Giffords. In other instances, I mean, it's we didn't have to worry about this in the election space, this level and this severity of violence. But the good news is it is happening while there's a good level of cooperation among federal and state and local with intelligence gathering coming out of that 2016 election. But it's unusual. We're having to adapt law. Secretary Chapman mentioned the fact that traditionally we had these electioneering free zones to protect folks who went in to go vote so they couldn't be intimidated or put under any duress or undue influence. And that, and those were restrictions of a few hundred feet or so around a polling place. We had to balance the First Amendment rights of folks to share their views on elections. But when it rises to a level of intimidation or harassment, that's where your First Amendment right stops, and somebody else's rights to be able to vote without all that steps in. And so we're having to adapt that because now people are voting in advance of Election Day. And some states, Kentucky, we just added a few early voting days. We have to add that. And then on the drop boxes, because drop boxes, what's extraordinary about all the news about drop boxes is I think it's something like 8 states used them prior to the 2020 election. Now, we always have had drop boxes. There are those blue boxes that USPS sticker on the side, or you have one in front of your house or your building called a mailbox. Those are drop boxes too. But now we have these official, more secure drop boxes. And people now know that, hey, if I see somebody going there, then they have a ballot and they're voting, and which has created an opportunity, for our bad actors. So we have to provide that protection. And we also have to figure out how to use those existing laws and then adapt them to provide that safeguard. I think for folks who are worried about things like that, you can bring things into buildings. Buildings have more security. You can go to other drop boxes. You can ask for report. You can mail things. I mean, there are ways to handle this. It's an unfortunate way to live in this kind of world. But in the same way, in our everyday lives, we have to kind of pay attention and see what's going on. Unfortunately, when we're casting a vote, performing our civic duty, we may have to do a little bit of that too. My hope is that this will be, that some of these safeguards will result in a good election day. I mean, what's tricky about all this is when we talk about these things, this is always this balance. If we talk about them, are we creating a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy? The reason why we're talking about it is we think it's risen to a serious enough threat that we're going to run the risk of giving somebody an idea that they might otherwise not have had, because so many people already have that idea. And we need to make sure that voters can empower themselves and election administrators can put those protections in place. So it is a serious threat. Hopefully we'll wake up the day after the election saying, we did all that preparation and it paid off and we had a good, clean election day. The other thing I'd like to note was it's not like it's simple as saying, let's put law enforcement next to every drop box. I mean, setting aside the resource challenge, that creates a different type of challenge. That creates a different type of intimidation that folks don't necessarily want to have law enforcement right there either. So it's this providing this proper balance. People feel comfortable casting their vote and whatever they're allowed to under state law. That folks can exercise their First Amendment rights in a way that's safe and secure, and that we can conduct this election the way we need to, and that the person who got the most votes wins. Period. That's what we're hoping for.
Agreed. I appreciate that from both of you. I want to shift topics just slightly, and one of you, I think Secretary Chapman, you mentioned this at the top as well, talking about so-called insider threats, right? And folks may not know, sort of what we mean by that, right? We know that in particular partisan organizations and actors, but others have been, for instance, aggressively recruiting those who may, be conspiracy theorists or election deniers, we'll say, to serve in official capacities, right? And this is sort of separate from poll workers and election officials, or from poll workers and poll watchers, but in the official capacities on county commissions, election boards, right? Where these are folks that have sort of official powers over election. And then we know at the same time, those folks are recruiting or trying to recruit sort of the everyday person worker to help administer an election in the same vein. And then we also know there's a sort of a separate lane for partisan poll watchers, right, that are ostensibly recruited by political parties as part of transparency measures, but that we know there are some nefarious actors that are, again, trying to use that process to sort of recruit folks who have a particular view about elections. And in many cases, these organizations are, priming them with some of that harmful mis and disinformation, malinformation that we talked about, and sort of giving them the theory that they might have some additional powers that they don't have, right? So for instance, in Arizona, I know a story came out recently where John Eastman, who folks might know as a former attorney for the former president, who's also being investigated himself by the January 6th committee, and in his role in advising President Trump on ways to overturn the 2020 election, right? We know Mr. Eastman in Arizona was encouraging folks in this vein to take some actions that may end up, we hope not, right? But potentially disrupting voting or provoking some confrontations that don't have to happen, right? And so in that context of what's happening, I wonder in general, what do people need to know about the actual danger that this dynamic poses, and what systems are in place internally to try to ensure that, as you said, Secretary Grayson, the final election results are absolutely the will of the people, but also that the folks that are working on our elections are about the purpose that you want them set to about, if that makes sense. So let's start with Secretary Grayson this time, I think.
Sure. So you're right. You used the T word, transparency, which is one of the most important principles upon which we build our elections. And we recognize that elections have important outcomes. Different political parties, different points of view, different ideologies have different perspectives on who wins, who loses, and that sort of thing. And so in America, what we've decided to do to try to address the partisanship concerns is to kind of bake it in. We want our political parties, we want our activists to be playing a role in our elections, even if they're not elected. But they, at most polling places, you have a relatively equal number of folks from Republican side and Democratic side. The certification process is usually bipartisan. You can have poll watchers, which is somebody who can go in and literally watch the voting. In most states, and this is a best practice, requires some level of training so that person knows what they're seeing. You can also count, you can observe the absentee ballot count and then the election night and thereafter count, so people can have confidence. And the hope is that someone will go back to a party meeting and say, I watched, I know we didn't like who won, we didn't like that outcome, but it was fair. And so we build all that in. Unfortunately, that transparency opens doors that bad actors can take advantage of. So that's why we have to have those safeguards like registration, meaning you can't just show up and say, I'm a poll watcher in almost any, I think probably no jurisdiction. You usually have to register in advance, so we know who's there. In most jurisdictions, there's a requirement of some level of training. And if there isn't one, I know in Pennsylvania, the governor vetoed a bill that would have opened up the polling places, I think, to a little bit more poll watching, but without the requisite training. And he cited that as a reason for vetoing the bill, which was correct. You shouldn't have people there without that level of training. And again, as we were talking earlier, even in the Dropbox setting, we want to make sure that voters, if you go in and you see something or somebody's aggressive or intimidating, voters should be able to feel comfortable reporting that, as well as the folks who are there, the regular precinct officers or poll workers. That's part of their job too, is on the outlook to be on the lookout for that, to make sure that people will be able to vote in private and feel comfortable about that outcome. There are a lot of groups that have, Secretary mentioned a phone number that they have. Other groups have call-in numbers that people can use, or social media to try to report things, and we can work through that. But it is disappointing that some of these systems and structures that we set up to provide that safeguard are being taken advantage of a little bit. But the flip side of that is we saw in 2020, a Republican Secretary of State who voted for the Republican president stand up to that president on the phone in a very heated moment. We saw in Michigan, a lot of pressure on certification and folks doing that as well. And there's so many instances of that happening that it's actually not newsworthy traditionally. It became newsworthy in 2020. It'll become newsworthy in 2022. But hopefully it'll all be people doing their right jobs. And when they don't, we have laws in the books that we can pursue and prosecute. when people aren't doing their jobs. And that's where the courts play a big role.
Thanks for that. Secretary Chapman.
Sure. So I wanted to address this question from the perspective of insider threat. And, there's always been a risk of insider threats, but it's something that we are definitely taking a look at and making sure that counties have training for it, because insider threats could be intentional. It could be, a poll worker or an election worker that intentionally wants to disrupt the electoral process, or it could be unintentional. So it could be an election official that might not have adequate training, or someone who may click on a phishing email accidentally, thinking it's a legitimate email, and then open their county to a cybersecurity threat. So we are really making sure that counties have the ability to spot those issues. We are doing phishing exercises with Department of Homeland Security and the counties to make sure that any unintentional threat is addressed, and that counties have the training to spot something like that. So that's something that we have extensively done. As far as poll watchers and authorized representatives, so in Pennsylvania, poll watchers are the ones that can be inside the polling place on election day, and authorized representatives are those that can view the canvass or the counting of ballots. And as Secretary Grayson mentioned, they have to apply for this, in advance of election day for the county. They are bipartisan, so it is a transparent process, but there are rules and regulations as far as what they can and cannot do inside the polling place or while they're observing the canvass. And if these poll watchers or authorized representatives defy what they're supposed to do, if they defy the law or the policies that the county has set up, county election directors have the ability to remove them. But it's one thing that's important is these individuals also take an oath of office, the same oath of office I took when I was sworn in as acting secretary, to uphold the US Constitution, to uphold the Pennsylvania Constitution. And so we take that very seriously, and counties do have the ability to address and remove them from a situation that might be harmful to the electoral process.
Thanks so much for that from both of you. Just one particular follow-up, because the one instance that I know that at CAP especially we've done a lot of work on is taking a look at election certification issues, right? And so similarly, right, you have folks who are on these county boards, canvassing boards, et cetera, that takes oaths, I imagine. But we know, and we've seen instances from recent elections, right, even from primaries, where officials have refused to certify election results based on nothing more than unproven false allegations in many senses. And so the first question here, just as a baseline matter, isn't that ultimately illegal to not certify? And then the second question is, what can we do about that? Are there other consequences that we need to talk about when officials refuse to fulfill those roles, and other ways that we can get perhaps the federal law enforcement to step in? And Secretary Chapman, we'll start with you.
Sure. So we had a recent example of this in Pennsylvania after the primary election. So as far as how the certification process works in Pennsylvania, the counties canvass the votes, they count them, and they are required to certify their results up to 20 days after the election to me. And then I certify the results. So we have two certifications at the county level and then the Secretary of State level. So what happened in the primary election is there was a court case around undated ballots. So ballots, legally cast ballots from eligible voters where a voter failed to write the date on there. And there were 3 counties that refused to count those ballots. So we decided, we pursued litigation. A court ordered them to count them. And there's ongoing litigation about that right now. So we are awaiting a decision from the state Supreme Court. But I think one thing that's important is that we expect counties to follow our guidance. If there is a court case that comes down that says count these ballots, don't count these ballots based on the merits of the case, we immediately send an email, update guidance to counties so they have clarity on what to do. And so that's something that we expect them to do. If they don't, then we evaluate our options. And some of those options may include litigation, as was done in the primary. But we do every attempt to make sure that counties know what the law is, what the election code says, what court orders say, what guidance is, so they're clear. But there are situations where that happens, and we experience that in the primary election.
So, and I think what Secretary Chapman described were kind of the more traditional problems we would have with certification that litigation took care of, or maybe because of litigation there was some level of either uncertainty or anyway, that was the more traditional kind of certification challenges we used to have. Where we have seen a little bit in a couple of other states. In New Mexico, for example, there was a county that just with no evidence, with no litigation, on their own said, we don't trust the outcome and we're not going to certify. And so that's when the state stepped in, and Secretary of State, I forget exactly who the actual plaintiff was, but somebody stepped in from the government and said, no, no board, you do have to certify. There's nothing that allows you to not certify. There's no evidence, there's no law, there's nothing, there's no court order. You have to certify. The judge agreed and issued an order ordering the board to certify the race, and they did. And so that I at the end of my last answer I talked about the court stepping in. And so if we do have folks coming in and saying, I don't trust those machines, they're Dominion or whatever, and yes and yes, I don't like, I want it to be hand counted, all these, some of these things we're hearing that are made up, misinformation, disinformation. The courts can step in and force these actors. And so it is, you have to do your job. It may not be criminal to not do your job in all settings, but a court can order you to do it. And then if you don't do it, then you're running into contempt issues and things like that. And so those courts provide that important safeguard. And I feel pretty good. Our courts have done a pretty good job. And again, we can disagree on some of the interpretations on some of these rules, but on some of the things that are just clear cut, like you have to certify. There's no reason why you can't certify. We see the courts step up, and folks usually don't want to defy a court order like that, and they back down. So hopefully we won't have too many situations like that. But the courts are our ally in the situation, and the facts are clear. In elections, as Secretary Chapman described the process in Pennsylvania, that's a fairly normal system of certification. Some states, like in Kentucky, it's actually the State Board of Elections that does the certification, not just the Secretary of State. So there are several others who cast votes, but the description in Pennsylvania is pretty accurate, and the courts will step in and make sure that people follow the law if they don't do so.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. So I have another question for you all, switching gears, and some folks have alluded to this in some of the audience questions that have come in, which is good, right? Because the basis of our discussion is that we really needed and are happy to hear from two bipartisan voices who have been outspoken, as you all have, on the ways to protect our elections. And certainly we both have extensive histories, which I didn't go into the beginning. I was so excited to dive into our discussion, but certainly Secretary Grayson, we know of your 20 years of experience here, and Secretary Chapman, we know both from your work before assuming office as an advocate at leadership conference and other places, even going back to your days at Howard Law, hat tip to my Howard Law predecessor there. And so, I'm curious, as we look beyond this election, right? And we're hoping, as you said, everything goes well and all of our preparations, you prepare, right? To make sure you're ready, but hopefully that, sort of the doomsday scenarios don't come to pass. But looking long term, right, for the future of our elections, but also the future of the health of our democracy, we really think it's important that we have a basis from which folks from whatever side of the aisle or no side, right, can agree on the manner in which we should conduct our elections, our civic discourse. And so some of this we've talked about already, whether it be eschewing political violence or, making sure that all votes are counted, transparency. But in your minds, as you do this work and talk to colleagues and think about the broader context, that we're living in, what are some of the the ways that you see us going forward collectively. Like if you were building scaffolding, right, for a basis of bipartisan cooperation on elections, what are some of the things that you would want folks to be thinking about and agreeing to? I know that's a big question, but we got big brains to answer it. So I think starting with Secretary Grayson this time, I believe. Yeah.
So I'll start with a bill that's pending before Congress. It looks like it has a chance to get passed by the end of the year, is the Electoral Count Act. This is not the most profound election reform change, but it is a reaction to the January 6th, what happened on January 6th, and some of the confusion that was sowed because of the problems with the existing Electoral Count Act and people trying to take advantage of that confusion of that archaic law. The Senate's got a bill that received overwhelming support in committee. Not just token bipartisanship, but everybody, I think, but one member voted for it. I was actually with Republican leader McConnell yesterday at a public business roundtable. I got a chance to ask a question, so I asked him about the likelihood of passage, and he felt pretty confident that something would pass and it would look pretty similar to what the Senate has done, which again has that bipartisan support. That's an important signal, I think, to the country, because if Congress were to pass that, and they do that in a bipartisan way where you've got the Senate, to get anything through that's not reconciliation, has to be bipartisan. The House would go along with it, the president would sign it. That would help. It immediately addresses some of the the concerns coming out of January 6th. It puts us in a much better position in the 2024 election, when I'm sure going to have a very heated presidential election again, regardless of who the candidates are. And so I hope that really comes to pass. Because it's that kind of signaling is important, and doing it in a bipartisan manner. I think the second thing is, I really appreciate what my former colleagues, Secretary Chapman and others around the country, in a bipartisan manner, have been talking about these kinds of issues, and as well as local election administrators of all political stripes, continuing to be public with their concerns with being transparent about how the process works and explaining it. And then I think also, if we have another election, and this is kind of odd, but I think having elections with different parties winning and losing, and people coming to grips with all that and realizing that's just the system. Sometimes you're going to be happy with the result, sometimes you're not going to be happy with the result. I mean, I remember the last general election that I ever saw, two friends of mine were running against each other for Congress. It was a really close race, and I remember on election night being on the phone explaining to one, and then the campaign manager / chief of staff for the other, here are the rules, and they trusted me to explain the rules. Here's the outcomes. Here's what's going to happen. Here's the time frame. I was really proud of that, and I think that there are so many really good actors in election administration, and if the public were to see the hearts and the brains of the folks who are doing this, and they're getting a chance to see more of that, that'll increase the confidence that folks have. But again, I'd start with that ECA reform. I know Secretary Chapman and I were on a panel. Actually, I think I moderated a panel where you were speaking. I was just asking the questions. I was doing William a couple months ago on this in DC, and so I really hope that does in fact pass, because that'll get a nice boost as we go into a 2-year presidential cycle.
Fantastic. Secretary Chapman.
Yes. Well, the first and foremost, elections at the local and state level need to be fully funded. So that should be the first priority on a bipartisan basis, is to make sure that elections are fully funded from federal dollars and from state dollars. And, we noticed there was an influx of funding in 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, because a lot of states were implementing mail-in voting for the first time. And we also saw outside funding come in from third-party organizations. That has since been banned in Pennsylvania, but the state has appropriated $45 million on an annual basis to counties, so they have additional funding for elections. But it's not enough. We need to make sure that we are also having robust, consistent funding from the federal level, because counties need to be able to plan. A lot of counties use that third-party funding that came through, or that CARES Act funding in 2020 to buy new equipment. And in Pennsylvania, we were implementing mail-in voting for the first time because our law passed in 2019. So they bought machinery, they bought mail openers, but everything ages, right? So counties need to make sure that they are planning, that they have enough funding to hire enough staff, to make sure that they are counting votes and just, making sure that their election operation runs smoothly. So fully funding elections is important, and counties are really doing more work with less funds, which is something that I see as problematic, and we just need to get ahead of that issue. Also, counties are going to have to replace their voting systems. Voting systems age as well. And we did replacement in 2019 before the 2020 election, but everything that's a machine, everything that's a system, has the end of its useful life. So counties need to start planning for that. And we're in the process of replacing our state voter registration system right now, but it will have to be replaced in future years to come. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is risk limiting audits. We haven't talked much about that, but I think that's a place where we can definitely get some bipartisan support on. Risk limiting audits are the best. They're the gold standard for election audits. And this election, Pennsylvania will be implementing a post-election pre-certification risk limiting audit for the very first time, where all 67 counties are expected to conduct this risk limiting audit. And, it just enhances confidence in the electoral system. It uses statistics to ensure that the outcome of the election that was reported is accurate. And, we all want to make sure that that's true. So I think having RLAs in other states, and also having that enshrined in legislation moving forward is going to go a long way to ensure confidence in our electoral system. And as I mentioned before, I have to say pre-canvassing. We really need pre-canvassing before Election Day in Pennsylvania. There's bipartisan support for pre-canvassing, especially at the county level. Our County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania supports it, Republicans and Democrats. I think everybody at this point realizes the problem and that we're not going to have faster election results in any election as long as people are using mail-in voting at the rate that they are, unless we have that ample time to pre-canvass. So, any legislation at either the state level or the federal level that would allow that is something that we would support.
Awesome. I agree all three of those. I'm glad she mentioned all those. And even like, for example, Kentucky, we still require an excuse for mail-in voting, but we've given our locals the ability to process early if they need to. And yeah, but all three of those are good bipartisan things. And so +1 on Secretary Chapman's proposals there.
No, absolutely.
Co-sponsor them with you.
That's great. We're getting together already. Just one sort of small addendum question. I know we're coming close to time, but on the pre-canvassing issue, and you both talked about this a little bit. In terms of what to expect on election night, right? We've gotten questions about that, and we talked about different states and the ways that you can and can't pre-canvass, and so and what to expect in terms of like timing for results, right? And so I certainly we know that we're and should start thinking about a results window. Folks have talked about, right? Then like expecting elections or election results, an hour after polls close or something like that. But what are some ways? I'm wondering that secretaries of state, other officials, folks, sort of in the group are getting together to think about how we can organize trusted voices to be putting out the same kind of message to boost public confidence in the time frame between when polls close and when results come out. What kind of coordination is going on there, either on messaging or other actual pieces for either of you?
Sure. So I can start. It's hard to estimate when we're going to have results, but it's something that we know it's going to take a while. We're definitely not at the mail-in voting rates that we saw in the 2020 election. I think we had double requests at this time, and midterms have lower turnout than presidential elections. For us, it's a little hard because we don't have anything to compare to, because mail-in voting was passed in 2019. We don't have the 2018 midterm to compare, so it's not an apples to apples comparison. But we do know with the volume, it's going to take some time. So we have a voter education campaign in Pennsylvania called Ready to Vote, and it's all aimed at meeting voters where they are. We're sending emails, text messages. We have paid media campaign on social media, Twitter, just with information about how to vote in the voting process. And for this year, we have included a post-election phase just to let voters know, every vote must be counted. It takes time doesn't mean anything nefarious is happening. Let's have election officials count every vote, because we want to reassure the public and kind of counter and pre-bunk some of this mis and disinformation that is sure to happen. We've already seen that it's starting to percolate in the media around why it takes a while for us to have our results. So it's something that we're thinking through. We work with stakeholder organizations. We have meetings with them as well to ensure that, you know, they can report things to us, that we have a feedback loop. Also, you know, I know they're pushing out information to ensure voters that every vote must be counted. So that's really a message that we are going to be carrying and delivering to voters after the election.
I'll just add quickly, because I know we're running up to the hour. You know, for folks like me who are formers and we're not as busy on election day because we're no longer, you know, administering election or overseeing an election, you know, I want to encourage folks like, you know, like my, you know, former colleagues who are no longer a secretary, no longer running things at the local level, be engaged with your local media. You know, so like on election night, for example, I'm going to be in studio for Kentucky Education Television, which are a statewide PBS network, providing some election analysis. But part of that election analysis is election administration analysis to explain the expectations for when results were going to come in. If there are any problems, I'll be there to provide informed commentary about, you know, whether this is something to be alarmed or something normal. And so I think there's a real value in past election administrators to stand with the currents, you know, who are going to be really busy in the lead up and through election day, and then the certification process.
Awesome. I really appreciate that, and really appreciate this information-packed discussion. Hopefully folks see as I did the great work going on. So I just want to thank you all and our audience for joining us today. For more information, as has been put in the chat, you can get more information about what we're doing at CAP on these issues and our upcoming events on our website at www.americanprogress.org. I want to thank Secretary Grayson and Secretary Chapman, both for joining us today for the conversation, but more importantly, for all the work that you're doing on these issues that we've got to address together. And I know we're going to be doing some important work together on that list that you all ticked down, because that list is our list as well. So stay tuned for that. But thank you all for joining us, and have a fantastic day. And
Thank
go
you.
vote, please. Vote. Awesome.